Folks. So Jeff and I are doing a sermon series this month called Be Yourself, Everyone Else is Taken. And basically, it's about how to be our best selves, to help us all focus on our own authentic spiritual growth, to help us become more forgiving, more patient, more connected, more loving, all those things that make us feel better about ourselves because, in fact, they make us better selves. And today I want to focus on being more connected to the divine, to God, however you may call God, but also why we might want to be more connected to the divine. And for once, I'm not going to go all theological on you or deep into biblical history. I'm just going to tell a few stories because stories can be illuminating. And one story is from this book by Brené Brown, Braving the Wilderness, The Quest for True Belonging and the Courage to Stand Alone. And this is a book about what I think is one of the most profound spiritual crises of our time, our inability to connect with one another and with God. And it shows its face in loneliness and distance and isolation. And in this time of the COVID pandemic, this problem, I think, has been exacerbated exponentially. And these are weird times, aren't they? I mean, sometimes I look around at the world and look at my fellow human beings and wonder, was I dropped on Earth by aliens, or were they? Anyhow, Brené Brown defined spirituality in another book, actually, as recognizing and celebrating that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in love and compassion. We are all inextricably connected. Doesn't always feel like it, though, does it? We don't always recognize that, let alone celebrate it. You know, Janet and I love each other deeply, and we're both blessed to have jobs that we also love deeply, most of the time. I mean, most of the time we love our jobs. We love each other all the time. Just clarifying, right, honey? Honey? She's around here somewhere. But those jobs require a lot of our time and attention and emotional energy. And once in a while, we find that we get really, really busy and really wrapped up in our work, and we begin to feel a little less connected to each other. And neither of us likes that. And sometimes it ends up with one or the other of us losing it and having to do something perhaps a little, shall we say, dramatic to get the other's attention. Now, I know I'm telling stories this morning, but that's not one I'm actually going to tell in any detail, except to say that when we spend time talking about it and connecting again, we discover that underneath all the drama, we still have that deep connection. It's always there. And sometimes we just need to make a little noise to know we're being heard so that we can feel each other's presence. And I guess one of the things I'm saying is that we always have those connections. So how is it that we can't seem to access them all the time? Well, Brené Brown tells a story in her book, right here on page 43, about a guy named Bill Monroe. And Bill Monroe is basically the father of bluegrass music. I love bluegrass music, by the way. Apparently, as a child, Bill Monroe would hide in the woods in eastern Kentucky next to a railroad and watch the veterans from World War I returning home from the war as they walked along the tracks. And these weary soldiers would sometimes just stop and let out a long holler, a loud, high-pitched, bone-chilling holler, pain and freedom that cut through the air like the blare of a siren. And I thought about trying that just now, but I'm not even going to attempt it. But the minute you hear it, you know it. It's not a yippee or a painful wail, but something in between. A holler that's thick with both misery and redemption. A holler that belongs to another place and time. And today we call that sound high lonesome. And high lonesome is actually a sound or a type of music in the bluegrass tradition. It's a kind of music that's hard and full of pain, and it gives you goosebumps. And when you hear that holler and bluegrass music over the thumping mandolins and the twanging banjos, you can feel the heaviness of those soldiers' hollers, and you can even faintly make out the sound of a distant train chugging down the tracks. It's very evocative. And that's the sound of people who are utterly disconnected, high lonesome. And Brene Brown says the world feels high lonesome and heartbroken right now. And actually, she wrote that long before COVID, but it seems even more true today. We've sorted ourselves into factions based on our politics and our ideology, and we've turned away from one another and toward blame and rage. And this is a worldwide crisis. It's a health crisis and a financial crisis and a spiritual crisis. So how do we get back to that inextricable connection with each other and with the divine that's the hallmark of spirituality? Why do we get stuck in high lonesome? Because it seems to me we don't often even recognize, let alone celebrate, those inextricable connections with the divine and with one another. We are divided from others in almost every area of our lives. I know this crisis of COVID has brought out the best and the worst in people, and I celebrate the best, but sometimes we don't show up with one another in ways that acknowledge our connection. So what are we going to do? What can we do? Okay, that's a couple questions. I'm just going to leave right there and just tell another story. This story is from the Bible. I know, what a concept, eh? And this story is from the book of Genesis about a man named Jacob. In our Bible study recently, we've done a bit of looking at some of the patriarchs, and we'll be looking just a little bit more at Jacob next week. But Jacob was a bit of a, well, frankly, a jerk. He was a jerk. He was the son of Isaac and Rebekah, and Isaac was the son of Abraham and Sarah. And when our story opens, Jacob is basically running for his life from his twin brother Esau because he'd stolen something precious from him. Never mind what. This is actually a much longer story, and I'm only going to give you the Reader's Digest abridged version. Anyhow, Jacob's on the lam, and he finds himself in the middle of the wilderness, in the desert, in what is now the country of Jordan. I've been there. It is the most desolate place I have ever been. Nothing but rocks and dust. As far as the eye can see, not a tree, not a shrub, not even a little green weed. It's like the landscape of Mars with the climate of Venus. It's otherworldly. I'd be tempted to call it godforsaken, but it turns out I'd be wrong about that. As a side story, I will tell you that when I found myself there with a Bible professor and a couple of other seminarians, and sadly a flat tire, it seemed like the loneliest place on earth too. Not a single sign of human habitation for miles. Turns out I was wrong about that too. In fact, its remoteness meant that the Jordanian army had a weapons testing range out there, and our every move was being carefully monitored, which was good because it turned out our spare was flat too. And suddenly 2 truckloads of soldiers arrived to get us back on the road with I thought rather more firepower than they really needed to intimidate a bunch of Bible scholars, but hey, whatever works. Anyhow, this is the landscape that Jacob found himself in. So bleak, so bleak. And when the sun had set, and it was too dark for him to run away any longer, he stopped for the night, and he had nothing, so he laid down in the dust with a stone for a pillow. And he dreamed a dream. It says in Genesis 28 that he dreamed that there was a ladder set upon the earth, the top of it reaching into heaven, and the angels of God were going up and down on it between heaven and earth. And in the dream, God appeared to Jacob and said, I am the God of your ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, the God of your parents, Isaac and Rebekah. Know that I am with you wherever you go, and I will keep you and bring you back to your home. I'm with you. I will keep you. I will bring you to the place you belong. So Jacob woke up from his dream and he was amazed. And he said to himself, because there was no one else there, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And he named the place Bethel, which means house of God. Now, one of my favorite authors is Madeleine L'Engle. From the time I read her award-winning children's science fiction book, A Wrinkle in Time, which probably explains my lifelong interest in science fiction. And she's also written a lot of great books on spirituality, including a trilogy on the book of Genesis, and the second book, A Stone for a Pillow. This one, great book, Stone for a Pillow. And it's all about Jacob. And she says, as always, when I struggle to find the truth of something, I turn to story for illumination. And as I grapple with the angels of difficult questions, I think of Jacob, who saw a ladder of angels reaching from earth to heaven, linking heaven to earth, the creation and the creator, not separated from one another, but participating in one another. Delight, at one-ment. And the stories of Jacob are some of my favorite stories in the Bible, because he really was a jerk. He was his own worst enemy, and he was so infuriatingly human. And I suspect that there were many times in his life when Jacob experienced intense loneliness. He was alienated from his family for years. He was out in the middle of the desert. And so is there anyone in the world who hasn't, at one time or another, experienced this kind of high lonesome, when all support systems seem to fail, when there's nobody there, nobody. And at times like that, it seems even harder to reach out to God. So what is the way out of the wilderness, out of the high lonesome? And in her book, Brene Brown says it's not going to be easy. Like all meaningful endeavors, it's going to require vulnerability and the willingness to choose courage over comfort. And I'm thinking Jacob, trying to sleep on the ground with his head on a rock, wasn't very comfortable. And I expect there were a lot of things keeping him awake that night. Loneliness, fear, guilt, the hard ground, the even harder rock. And yet I have found often, like Jacob, that in those dark nights of the soul, when I am most empty, when I feel most disconnected, when I am exhausted beyond all ability even to think, when I am most uncomfortable, that is when I'm most open to wonder and most willing to accept grace. There are actually a couple of songs that are based on the story of Jacob at Bethel. One of them we often sing after our lessons for life. Surely the presence of our God is in this place. I can feel God's mighty power and God's grace. I can hear the brush of angels' wings. I see glory on each face. Surely the presence of our God is in this place. And that's kind of the key. We don't actually have to find our way out of the wilderness, out of the high lonesome, because God is in the high lonesome with us. God is the God of sea and sky and mountain and valley, even the valley of the shadow of death. And God is the God of the wilderness. Indeed, I think sometimes that the wilderness may be one of God's favorite places. In the wilderness, surely the presence of our God is in this place. We can recognize and celebrate that we are all inextricably connected to each other by a power greater than all of us, and that our connection to that power and to one another is grounded in God's unconditional love and compassion. And when we realize that, as the song goes, we will feel the touch of angels' wings and know that we're not alone. Amen.